You're listening to 101 Part-Time Jobs with me, Giles Bidder, and I've got Benny Horowitz on the line here from the Gaslight Anthem and also Mercy Union, which is the song playing behind this. Me and Benny were talking for about an hour before I actually pressed record on this, talking about history and stuff, and I don't know, I wasn't really expecting him to get back to me when I reached out, but he did. So shout out Benny. Thank you so much for doing this before I had any other names to kind of coerce you into it. Benny tells me about growing up in New Jersey, his upbringing, what was going on around him and what got him into music and putting on shows and getting into hardcore. All stories from that to come, as well as the start of the Gaslight Anthem and an incredible story from when he was working at the head of a newspaper where he was literally putting together the pages and organizing the printing. And there's an incredible story from, so I'm kind of losing my shit here thinking about it. How did he say it? Dicking the Dictator. So there's all that to look forward to. You're listening to 101 Part-Time Jobs with me, Giles Bidder. If you could spare a second to rate and review and subscribe, I think that does something. East London's Signature Brew have been brewing music-inspired beers since 2011. You may know them from their collaboration beers brewed with the likes of Mastodon, Idols, Slaves, Mogwai, Enter Shikari, and a host of other bands. So you can go onto their website, signaturebrew.co.uk, and type and order something. And if you type in the code 101 podcast, then you're going to get 10% off. That's 101 podcast as a voucher thing, all capitals, and get 10% off everything you get there. All right, so this is 101 Part-Time Jobs with Benny Horowitz. Enjoy. I sure did.
When I started playing in my first band called Dilemma, I remember playing our first show, and I was outside, and I kind of wind up alone all the time. It's just my personality, like if a room is too much, if too much is going on, like I'm going outside to like sit by myself for a while. Even when I was little, So I'm 13 and I'm outside after we played our show, and a girl who I knew from school had come up to me and been like, "Hey, that was a really cool show." And she talked to me, and I was like, "Whoa, like that's cool." And I really think that's when I kind of discovered the fact that I found something that could make me relevant. Like I found something that maybe I was good at, and that could make me relevant and make me feel a certain way and give me that confidence, like I'm doing something good. And I think that's where the taste kind of came in and where my natural level of ambition started to meet it. Because I don't know who taught me it, but I just thought if anyone could do something, I could do it too. So by shortly in that band, I had started booking a lot of our shows. And not only booking in other places, but like booking the show and then just putting us on it once I started meeting bands. And then I started securing halls and stuff. And before you know it, like I was a half promoter, even more than a musician at that time.
And you've been quite a good person to follow on Instagram and Twitter in the last couple of months when you're posting these old flyers.
Oh man, there's been some cool stuff popping up. It
makes me incredibly excited. Even if I don't know the bands, I'm like, fuck, this is cool. Doing something is cool, making it happen.
And honestly, I'm ecstatic to see that stuff, because so many of those things I had no idea there was like permanent record of. I didn't even know there was video of some of these shows. Like someone posted a video the other day of Converge at my Elks Lodge in '96. And there's, 15-year-old chubby version of me losing my shit in the front, because I always thought shows, trickled top down, just like the way a wedding does, like if you go to a wedding and the couple doesn't seem to be having a good time, the wedding sucks. Like you can't have a good wedding if like the top is not having fun. But if they're out there like a little drunk and dancing and really getting into it, the whole wedding pops off, So I always thought like I'm the promoter. I book these bands. If no one's dancing, like I'm starting to fucking pit. Like I want this show to be good. I want it to rip, but I want like it to feel a certain way and look a certain way.
If like just 10 people start even making a few like motions, right? Just, I don't know, swinging their arms or something, within minutes, people get into it.
Yeah, it's true.
And I think there's real science there.
There is definitely like psychology there, 100%, because it's almost like, it's like you're allowing yourself to be vulnerable first. You know, you're subjecting yourself to the court of public opinion first. And if you're like, I don't give a shit how my dance moves look, how I look, I'm just going to like get into this band and do it the way I know and pretend like nobody's watching. That makes other people feel more comfortable, I think, because now they're less exposed. But I've seen so many shows, like hundreds of shows, where people were so into a band and kind of just waiting and watching for someone else to just start it, you know, just someone else to get it going, someone else to move, and no one did. And the show was boring as fuck because of it. You know, this great band played and there was like no visceral reaction to it. So yeah, I always used to do that at my shows. And I also always used to like go on the mic in the middle of the shows and talk to people about how this is like a community experience and it's just me and my friends doing this. And, you know, if you want to keep this going, like don't fight, don't bring the cops here. And if you really want to help, stay after, grab a fucking broom. Like, let's do this all together. I'm not making any money, you know? And I tried to really promote this like unifying community experience, and not for any value, but for the fact that like I truly believe in that, and I still do. You know, and I can say it safely, especially now with what you're talking about. I almost didn't realize the importance of these shows to some people until I started seeing some of these videos and flyers and people's reactions to it, where they're like, dude, those Manville Elk shows like saved me when I was a kid. And like, you know, I had nowhere else to go. And these were like the best shows, blah, blah, blah. And it was the same exact thing for me, even though I was putting them on, you know, like I needed that and I needed it badly. I needed a room of people that felt like me, you know, and I truly believe in the power of that. Yeah, I do. And I still do. And I'll do anything in my power to keep that kind of spirit alive.
I'm with you. Touring around Germany a few years ago with my old band, you know, you'd find some scenes, some groups of friends renting out a place and just basically giving the best night of your and their week or month or year or life, you know? Right. And it's like, that's, I don't know, there's something so special about that, because I think we're all brought up to think, we should be doing this, we should be doing that. And then when you make something for yourself, right, and it's just the most powerful thing in the world. Yeah, it makes you feel important, you know, and not in a weird self-important way. It's important because you're sharing something with the people around you.
Everybody needs to feel important every once in a while, man. And, you know, for people who weren't getting it at home, you know, a lot of people get it at home. You know, they feel important every time they walk through the door. They feel good. Their parents are doing a good job. Their friends and their family are doing a good job, you know, supporting them through life where they feel a certain way. And you know what? 90% of the kids I met at these shows did not have that experience. You know, they were kids from a lot of broken families, a lot of weird families, a lot of, you know, it wasn't just me who was searching for something more there, you know, like we were searching for something. We all really needed each other. There was also people who, you know, I realize now, especially in the heavier hardcore scene, that, you know, I think a lot of people were just attracted to maybe the violence and the aggression of it. And I've watched a lot of people come out of the scene and then turn kind of back into like conservatives and, you know, kind of follow their family model back to exactly where they started. And I have to imagine those people were never really attracted to the cause itself. They were, you know, attracted to, like I said, like the violence and the aggression and just something fast and loud, you know, which is fine. It wasn't a bellwether moment for everybody, you know, but it did serve that purpose. And I love this video bank that just came out. It's a guy named Tim Morris who passed away. He was a few years older than me. And he had done a number of shows down in, you know, South Jersey area, more by the beach. And, you know, I knew him because he was a promoter, but I didn't know him personally. And then somebody unearthed his archive a few years ago, which is massive. He has this massive video archive of all these shows. And I had no idea that guy was recording these shows.
I think I saw the Lifetime one.
Yeah.
Well, one of the Lifetime ones from CBGB's.
Cool. Yeah, and it was like...
It sounded good.
I know, yeah. They really were like good videos. People forget when you use real video equipment how much better it sounds in an iPhone. But yeah, it's been, like I said, it's been an absolute like pleasure to watch that stuff. And every time I see it, I do sort of tap into this young version of me and remember, you know, like I said, like how much it meant to me. You know?
Right. And music remains to be the most exciting thing in life for so many of us.
For sure, man. Yeah.
So you were putting on those shows. Were you quite good with the books, with the kind of money sort of, you know, numbers side of it?
I guess so, in like a basic way. You know, even today, I'm very disciplined with money, you know, like if I need $100 for something, you're not going to see me like, you know, buying a soda and chips and giving someone 95, you know, or something like that. So I do think I had a reputation really early of taking care of bands and like, but the interesting thing about it, this is long before contracts. And it was almost in a time where if you were a fairly local band, it was almost like bad taste to ask how much money you were going to get and stuff. It was weird. And it was basically just this assumption that if a lot of people came, you would split the door a certain way and everybody would get taken care of. And that was the case, like at the beginning. And I think, you know, I had a good reputation with a lot of bands because when the money was there, they got the money. You know, I was never pocketing money and going home. And then eventually I started booking a place called the Manville Elks Lodge. And I kind of got lucky in that scenario. I'll tell you why. Like, so the people who were running the Elks at the time were a guy named Dan and Kevin Shields. And they were part of a family that ran a gymnastics studio in Hillsborough, New Jersey, that me and my family went to when we were kids. So I started trying to book shows there, and they recognized my last name, and they're like, "Oh, you're like little Benny Horowitz, and we're the Shields," and you know, and there was a little bit of a connection. And imagine this is like a 14-year-old, chubby punk rock, more hardcore, I guess, like Jewish kid walking in Manville, New Jersey, is about as like lower middle class white trash as you can get, you know, like it's up there, you know? And so this is another place I was met with some bizarre sociocultural stuff. But it turns out these Shields brothers were in an 80s punk rock band called Detention, who was actually very famous and played with like the Ramones and Suicidal Tendencies and Social Distortion. And anybody who was around at that time, when I was like, "Did you know Detention?" They were like, "Yeah, fuck yeah, Detention was awesome." So
Great.
I kind of lucked out in the fact that like I found the one trashy Elks Lodge in New Jersey that was run by two old punk rock guys in a way. So they actually used to sort me out a lot. It was kind of it cost $500 to rent that hall, which at the time was quite expensive, you know, because it was sort of against convention at that time to charge more than $5 for a show. And if you couldn't charge much more than $5, and you better have a big band on it. So I owe it when I first started doing shows, it was $5, 4 with a can of food. And then eventually I made the big jump to $6, 5 with a can of food. But that basically meant I needed 100 paying people every show just to pay the hall. Right. So I was put in a bad position a lot early on where I had very little money for bands, especially when I started paying touring bands. Luckily, the Shields brothers, who were, let's say, loose with the morality of laws, I think is a nice way to put it. You know, they'd be like, "Just give us 200 for this one. Give us 300 for this one. And then you can pay the bands," you know? So they were generous in that way. They also eventually got caught siphoning money from my shows. Like, you know, there was that too. So what I was saying before that, this was like before contracts. And I remember the first contract I got was for H2O. And I had already booked H2O a couple times. And again, I'm Mr. like self-righteous little punk rock kid. And I'm booking this show and I get a contract from Stormy Shepherd. It was the first time a booking agent contract came to my house. And I was furious. I was so mad. I'm like, a contract?
Because you felt that level of trust had been like kind of disrespected?
No, I think it was more just like super blind little punk rock kid stuff, honestly. It was just like, this isn't cool. This isn't punk, in my young, naive, gathering of things. So I remember what I did too. Like a little asshole, I took a fucking Sharpie and I just X'd out 3 of the pages. I circled the money, and then I wrote like the food and drinks they'd get and signed the bottom and sent it back. And then I called Toby from H2O. I'm like, what the fuck is this, man? I was like, I got a contract. What is that? And he's like, bro, yo, kid. He's like, that's a club contract, kid. That's a club contract. You shouldn't have gotten that. And I'm like, oh, okay. So it was really like, it was such a different world, man. But that was when kind of that changed to when these smaller like underground shows like hardcore punk and emo kind of started like advancing to the next level. And I sort of like jumped out of it right before it did. And I actually kind of handed over my hall to a guy named Ricky Saporta. He ran a thing called Bomb Shelter Productions, and he took it over and fucking blew it out. All of a sudden there was like a year or two later, there was like a, Get Up Kids Newfound Glory show there that was like 1,000 people were at. And I'm like,
sure.
And he's like selling tickets and doing the whole thing. And I'm like, all right, like this is the next level, but by then I had started to move more towards trying to play, honestly, than promote. I think I had started getting a little tired of it at that point.
And so what were you doing to subsidize yourself? Did you have kind of like cash in hand jobs? Because you're putting on shows, you're playing in bands, like, anyone who knows anyone who's done that knows that it takes up so much of your time.
Yes. Yeah, no, I know this podcast is about your secondary jobs. We're 50 minutes in and just getting into it. But yeah, I always had jobs the entire time. I didn't spend much time at home at all. And the more I think about it, I think it was intentional. But yeah, I started working when I was 14. It was a holiday job where I was extra help at a small packaging and shipping store, for the kind of Christmas, New Year's rush that they used to get at that time, pre-Amazon. So I worked there for a few months. I was a squirrely little Jewish guy who listened to a lot of Bob Dylan. I think he was an old hippie. Pretty cool. Store closed about 6 months after I stopped working there. And then shortly after, I was getting a couple subs with my mom. Do you know what a sub is?
No.
It's like a submarine sandwich, like a long roll filled with
like a Subway.
Yeah, like a Subway, but just like good. Yeah. And yeah, I started. There was this small. It was actually called a general store because it was in a really small old village, like part of town, but it was pretty close. I lived in this like condo apartment complex with my mom, and it was actually pretty close to it. And me and my mom were in there, and she was a very social person, and she knew the owners, and we were chatting with them one day, and I realized they needed help, and I just was like, "Can I work here?" And they said yes. And that was like the next year and a half I spent working at this general store deli. The first 6 months to a year or so, I was pretty much just, cleaning floors, cleaning up after the food service, restocking, drinks and food. And then eventually, after about a year, I started helping in the kitchen. I remember Mondays were egg and potato salad day. So I was like, I had to bring in 3 sheets of eggs, 100 eggs, sack of potatoes, and I'd have to basically just boil and peel all of them. That was my job on Mondays. And then I started even working behind the counter a little. I wasn't supposed to. You were supposed to be 18 to work a deli slicer and shit. I did nip off my finger once on a deli slicer.
Oh, shit.
But yeah, I worked there for about a year and a half, and then I started to get really despondent about it. I was like, you know, I wanted a raise and he wouldn't give me one. So then I stopped caring. I started like jerking off up in the attic and like, just being stealing cigarettes and like just being a piece of shit.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
So then that job stopped. And that was, so that was like the first, probably up until like 15 or 16. And then I got a job at a chain bagel place called Bruegger's Bagels. I worked there for a good 6 months. And I know this is a strange sentence, but I worked for this like white trash Puerto Rican family that lived in my town. They were Puerto Ricans, but they didn't act like it, And there was like 17 of them in my school, and like 4 of them ran this bagel place, and they were terrible to work for. They were really mean. So one of my friends walked in one day, and I used to go in after school and basically be the janitor. I had to clean like the bagel vats, clean the tables, clean the floors, clean the dishes, and then leave. It was like the worst fucking 3 hours. And my friend came in one day. He's like, "You really should quit." And at that point, I hadn't even imagined ever quitting. It wasn't even in like the vernacular for me yet, where I was like, "Oh, you can just quit a job. That's weird."
Yeah.
And it seemed like something you shouldn't do, but I was pretty miserable. And somewhere towards the end of that job is when I got my license, when I turned 16 to 17. And I was driving home from the Bruegger's Bagels one day, and I saw that there was a Hollywood Video opening in Somerville, New Jersey. And that was like a chain video store like Blockbuster. And at the time, me and my mom, especially, and my whole family, were just like movie nuts, to the point that my mom had a VHS collection so large that she made a card catalog system to find videos. Like I said, she was an interesting lady who, when she got hyper obsessed, did very cool things. So I even still have a bunch of VHS with these little circle stickers and a number on the side. And then you literally filed through like a Rolodex to find your film. It's pretty fun. But, that was the extent of how much we watched movies. So I walked into this place cold, and I was like, "Are you guys hiring?" And I had a great conversation with the manager, and we started talking movies. I got hired on the spot and never went back to Bruegger's Bagels, luckily. And I was like, "Yo, this is the best job I ever scored. I can't believe I'm working at a movie store. This is like the coolest shit." And then he's like, "All right, yeah, you're hired. So, I'll provide the bow tie and cummerbund, and you need to buy the black dress pants and a tuxedo shirt." I'm like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" And it was part of the company policy that you had to dress up like a fucking movie theater usher to work there. So before I know it, I'm like, again, a chubby 16-year-old with long hair and like 8 earrings in my left ear, or 17 at that point. And and here I am in a fucking bow tie and cummerbund trying to work. So that was interesting. But that was a great job. I had that for over a year, probably towards the end of high school.
Was there quite a lot of pressure on you to do that? Because, were you helping out the family as well?
At that point, I was, yeah. So my family split up when I was like 11. At that time, my father had declared bankruptcy for himself, and really, wasn't much financial help. And my mom was a secretary, and we had 3 kids, 2 of which my older brother and sister were trying to go to college at that time. So yeah, there was almost like zero dispensable money at that time. So a lot of it was just to sustain my own personal life. Like you said, having enough money to get around, to go to shows, to eat while I'm out for 8 hours, things like that. I just needed a little cash in my pocket. There was no other choice. It was like, that was the choice, was like, you just had to work, if you wanted money. And then, at a certain point, like my mom did have to like borrow a little money from me a couple times, towards the end of that, a little irresponsibly, but like, yeah, it did get to a point where I was contributing maybe like a little more than I should have, in honesty. Um, and then towards the end of high school, Hollywood Video sort of fell apart, and it was actually like dying, like literally dying, because the industry was converting to DVD. Um, and unlike Blockbuster Video, Hollywood decided not to convert and stick with VHS, and it basically killed their business. So that business started dying, and I randomly knew like a football player from school. He was a nice kid, and he worked in this big like liquor wholesaler on the highway. It was called Super Saver Liquor Locker, and he got me a job there. And it was like a big like liquor warehouse almost, that sold like kegs and had stacks and stacks of beer up to the ceiling and like that kind of place. And there was basically like a gaggle of like 6 to 8 kind of tough, local kids who would always be working there. And I wound up with that job. And actually, subsequently at the same time, I moved out of my mom's apartment when I was 17. I had an opportunity. A friend of mine who was a year ahead of me had started going to school in New Brunswick, and his father, out of an investment, bought a house. A cheap house kind of in like the hood of that town. Is in Highland Park, right next to New Brunswick. And one of the cool things was while my buddy Evan was going to school, he was supposed to be fixing up this house and improving the value for his father. And then they rented out the rooms as this was going on. So I moved into that house before I even graduated high school, actually. And was working at that liquor store and, commuting back and forth. So at that point I'm starting to pay rent too.
And just being self-sufficient.
Yeah. And again, like not getting much help from, many people at all. Luckily it was cheap. I lived in like, what was a dining room that had no doors. And they had kind of hung these like half doors on it, but like they never really finished until I almost moved out. So I remember we ran a promotion at the liquor store that had a giant 6-foot cardboard cutout of Fabio. Do you know who Fabio is?
No, I don't.
You should look him up. He was like a strange sex symbol in like the 80s and 90s. He was, I think, a European model. So look up Fabio. It's pretty funny. He's like the face you see on the cover of romance novels, And I had this giant 6-foot cutout, and I actually had like affixed it to the gap in my door to make sure no one could see into my room. So it was the Fabio cutout that saved me at that place. And I ended up, it was funny. And it was a very funky house. That's another podcast all in itself. It was dubbed the House of Habits by some of my friends.
Great.
Not necessarily for me. Like, honestly, like I kept it pretty, considering the things going on around me, I kept it pretty straight considering.
It sounds like you were quite a smart kid.
Smart, but also like, I don't know why I always surrounded myself in people that were doing pretty reckless shit. I didn't necessarily always let myself do it, but there was something that attracted me to kids like that. They were my friends. I don't know what it was. So that's why I have been essentially like a rational sounding board to my friends ever since I was like a tiny little kid, pretty much.
And New Brunswick, there was a lot going on then, right?
Yeah. So that was definitely one of the reasons I, wanted to move up there was, the New Brunswick scene was like, that was the scene I was aspiring to. It wasn't New York, it was like the New Brunswick basement scene. Because right before I had moved up there was some really, really great houses and people that were doing some pretty crazy shit, like 67 Handy Street is where my buddy Chris Ross lived, and some of the guys from Lifetime and Endeavor and those bands lived. And those basement shows, I mean, you wouldn't even believe the bands that were playing in this basement, and then at the same time, Chris had started doing the Melody Bar, which was a very famous venue in New Brunswick. So yeah, I was head over heels about what was going on in New Brunswick, and kind of wanted nothing more than to be part of that scene at that time. So
it kind of makes me think, because a lot of these bands, like, you know, even if they weren't making money off it or whatever, in terms of that kind of reality of it, they were still doing it, you know?
yeah,
Did that make you think, I can do this?
it did. Yeah, it did. I mean, it is strange. I don't know exactly when it changed, but there was a pivot somewhere in like the late 90s, early 2000s where I think, and it might have been because of the, you know, like the Green Day Offspring thing. I'm really not sure exactly, like, socioculturally why, but where these bands could start to actually make a real living off their bands. I think like a little more money was put into it, a little more structure with the labels, and I mean, maybe it just got a little more capitalist. I'm not, you know, I'm not quite sure, but there was a pivot there where, like, you know, say like the Bouncing Souls were from New Brunswick at that time, and they were doing basement shows. And, you know, I went and saw them in Latex Generation in their basement when I was like 15, and they were touring and they were doing all that. But sure enough, those guys were getting home and they were working full-time jobs, you know, like,
right. That 15 years of documentary is absolutely incredible. And you see those guys wrapping up in 3 hoodies rather than, you know, having any kind of heating.
Yeah,
you know?
that's right. And so something did change where I think bands had an opportunity to start to go really full time at that time. It was an interesting pivot. But yeah, I definitely fully just immersed myself in the New Brunswick scene. I was young, you know, like, so I couldn't do the bar scene yet at all. I even used to go to that Melody Bar. I would play a show or go to one of the shows, and my friends would kick me out. You know,
aside from that, was it like a fairly inclusive scene, or was there conflict in there, especially the bands that were maybe asking for money in those later years?
No, I don't really remember conflict, honestly, especially on the inside of these bands. Like, it was very community based. I mean, of course, there was stuff going on, you know. I mean, show to show, you could have a bunch of fights at a show or something.
Right. I mean, more in a sense that, like, there's like a respect. Maybe respect's the wrong word, but yeah, this communication, yeah, that kind of feel that you're in it together and you're kind of helping each other out, I suppose.
Yes, I do think it still existed, like, in New Brunswick then, for sure. And like I said, it's those top-down people, you know. Chris Ross, who I'm talking about, you know, he was the drummer in a band called Ensign and a drummer in a band called Nora. And, you know, Chris was one of my great influences in this because he was kind of exactly like me. He was like the rational one in a sea of, like, mongoloids, you know, but like great and talented mongoloids that we loved, you know?
Right.
But, you know, he was the one doing the shows, you know, had the houses people could stay at, was extremely generous with just his time and thoughts. And yeah, he was someone who really definitely laid a groundwork for me, but he had a very similar way of looking at it. Yeah, something did change around that time, size wise, but even a band like even hardcore bands, you know, all of a sudden a Sick of It All or a Hatebreed were selling enough records and getting big enough that they could be full-time bands. And, you know, 5 years before that, if you told, you know, the Cro-Mags or something they could be full-time, they probably would have laughed at you, you know?
Right. Which is interesting for people my age, because I think of Sick of It All and I'm like, whoa, they were headlining, you know, the Astoria when it was up, which is, I forget what it was, like 500 or 1,000. You know, Sick of It All, to me, I grew up with them being like, yeah, that's like a full-time hardcore band, you know?
Yeah, you would think. And I think, honestly, until, like, Scratch the Surface, I don't know if they were really, like, I mean, they were obviously well-known and iconic and could go, you know, play wherever they wanted in the world and make a living, but not a great one, you know?
Yeah,
and I think, yeah, something changed there. And that's why I have such great respect for, like, certain style band that still exists now. Like, if you're, you know, really, like, droney or really heavy or doing something really experimental, I like the fact that they know they're never going to get that famous.
Yeah.
Like, I respect that. I respect
lifers is what I'd call them. You know, like people go down to the skate park every day. You know.
Yeah, exactly.
Your bands at the time, were you having some kind of, like, were you kind of gearing yourself towards, like, trying to play drums more and more?
Yeah, sure. Through this whole time I'm talking about, you know, having jobs and doing the shows, I was also playing in bands this entire time. So my first band was a band called Dilemma, who was like a, you know, a hardcore band in my early stages of high school. And that, like I said, was the band who, like, everybody in the band was about 2 years older than me. So, those guys were a little more tuned in. They knew how to get a recording done. They got a demo out. They knew how to make flyers and get them out. And probably really just taught me how to do that. I just watched and learned. And that band's the one that, gave me the inspiration for that. And then there was a little bit of a gap when I was really just more of a hardcore promoter. I don't even know if a lot of people knew I played drums. And I got hooked up. It was when the Descendants reunited in '95. I went to the Stone Pony to see the Everything Sucks tour when the Descendants came back. And I ran into a guy, Paul Ortenzio, who, I sort of knew from the scene, from this band Strength 691. And he had sort of loosely asked me to play in his band Yell Boy, who is like a pop punk band from the Woodbridge area. So, I was like, yeah, I'd be interested, but I'm like, you guys know I'm 15, right? And they were like, what? And I'm like, yeah, I'm 15. So I'm like, if you want me to go up there, like, I'm happy to do it, but you guys have to drive me, And this was like 45 minutes away. So these guys, to their credit, spent like over a year hauling my ass around up and back to practice until I got my license. And that band transformed into a band called Full Circle Swing. And then it transformed into a band called The Low End Theory. And that was my first like real band that actually got taken seriously. So somewhere in like 97, we probably started taking it seriously. And then around 98 or 99, we got signed to Eulogy Records, who started booking some tours for us. And that was my first taste at like, being in a real band who was signed and touring and stuff like that. And I started in that band I think that band started when I was like 16 or 17. And then it went for years up until, really 2002.
Around the time that I was introduced to the Gaslight Anthem in 2008, Sink or Swim had come out. My friends introduced me to it. It just blew my mind. And then, seeing you at the ULU on that tour that you did Reading and Leeds.
Yes. Yeah, same one.
Because it was in late August. So what was your life like around then? Because from my point of view, it seemed like you'd come from that same footing as kind of the New Brunswick thing, and you were becoming a modern day rock band. How was that between tours life, and what was it like as a profession, I suppose, is what it was turning into?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was right around the time that it was like, oh, this could be a profession, even though that was my ambition the entire time. Basically, if you asked me at any point through those years, I would have told you that my goal was to pay rent from playing music. Basically, it was like, if I can sustain my life from playing music, then that's success. And at the time when Gaslight started, I was actually the night production manager of a daily newspaper.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I worked for a place called the Daily Targum, which was a 5-day-a-week daily newspaper that ran on the Rutgers campus in New Brunswick. So it was technically a college newspaper, but that city has an undergrad population of like 50,000 people, and also it was sort of like a city newspaper in some ways, So I had gotten into that again through connections in the scene. The guy who was managing the office, the production manager at the time, was a guy named Chris Spleet, who was in bands. He was in a band called Nora. And he's also the guy who painted the cover of Sink or Swim.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, the actual original painting.
Fuck yeah.
So he brought me into the fold. I had to work nights for a number of reasons. I was actually, at the same time, I was the co-coordinator of an after-school program working with kids.
Amazing.
Yeah. Again, through a connection in the hardcore scene, my friend Jerry Waldron hired me. So I was doing that during the day, and then I started working this newspaper at night. And the manager is a guy named Clay Weirs, also a hardcore guy. And it was strange. It was this one part of this newspaper on a college campus that was almost all like punk rock run for years too, prior to me. So I had worked there for a while. At some point, I became an assistant manager, and then I had a chance to become the night production manager and just run the office myself. That was probably in I would say 2005 or something like that.
The sink or swim artwork, was it something that he'd already drawn, already painted, or did he purpose paint it?
It was purposely painted for us. It was original. We had a couple ideas about what it would be like, and then kind of gave him free reign. And when he created it, we were extremely happy with what he created, basically.
It's great artwork.
Yeah. I started managing this office. I quite like the job. I really think it's cool. We were paginators, where basically we worked with the editorial department where they would send us the loose files of the pages. We would clean them up, design them, place photos, place advertisements, and then work with the final editing team who would reread the stories and make sure everything was fine in them, and then release the paper. When I first started, it was still very analog, where we were printing to negative. And we had these, giant film machines where once we finished the pages, we were printing these giant negative sheets. And at the end of the night, someone was literally driving them to the press to get printed. And somewhere in '06 or something, we had converted to digital and everything became PDF at that point. Which actually, in reality, I held on to 2 or 3 employees for a couple years that I just didn't need. Because it got much simpler to run that newspaper after that.
So were you quite skilled with the software, with the InDesign? And
at that time, it was we were using Quark.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was very proficient in Quark, and then very proficient with using an Apple, and the short keys and stuff like that. But essentially, all of my knowledge of computers is based off of that job. So if there is anything I didn't do at that job, then I don't know how to do it.
Right. Must have been trial of fire for you going into that job.
It was. And it was definitely, I wound up in some situations that were way beyond me and way beyond my skill set. It's a quick story, but it's funny.
Yeah, go, please.
So twice a semester, the newspaper was called the Targum, the Daily Targum. And once a semester, they would make a joke issue called the Mugrat, which is Targum backwards. And, the editorial staff would write fake headlines, fake stories, try to trick people. And it was our responsibility to do a fake comics and diversions page, fake crossword puzzles, fake advice column. I used to write a funny fake advice column called Ask Dr. Glossy Feathersex. It was very lewd. It was fun. And a guy that I had hired, who's a punk rock drummer as well, a guy named Dan Pellick, we were deciding to fuck around, and he had created an image of Kim Jong-un being fucked by a horse. And we put this image into the paper. The managing editor, who was on the job that night, saw the image and approved it and let it go. And the following morning, I start getting calls, and apparently someone from the board of directors was so offended by this image that they resigned.
No.
Yeah.
They resigned. They didn't kick off. They just resigned.
They resigned. And before I know it, there's a sort of corporate heads are going to roll kind of situation going on where, me, who's not prepared for this, is on phone calls with the board of directors, standing up for myself and standing up for my employee. And essentially, if I threw him under the bus, I probably would have been fine. But, I stuck to the fact that, I'm his boss and I saw it and I allowed it. So it's on me. And then that managing editor, who, I should say was also a student, this wasn't a professional position. So it was a young person who was also figuring it out. They got scared and they threw us under the bus. So essentially my employee got fired, or had to leave, and I was given 2 weeks without pay. But they couldn't fire me because no one else knew how to do my job at that point.
Right.
So that was a little, I guess, example of, I even remember saying it on those conference calls with the board, being like, hey, listen, this is way out of my wheelhouse, man. Like, if you give me the authority to say what's negligible and not in this newspaper, there's going to be a lot of shit in there you don't like, because that's not my job. I'm like, my taste should not be in question here. I'm like, I'll make stuff, and if the managing editor approves it, then. So basically, I had that job. And it was a salary job with benefits. It was like, I was literally one of like 5 Rutgers employees, who couldn't actually go to Rutgers. It was kind of a strange.
It's really funny, and I like that there was satire in local.
Yeah, print. Yeah, it was cool. But I honestly, truly loved the job. It wasn't something that I like dreaded going into. I liked the work. I liked managing an office. Like, I thought that was cool. I liked managing people. I thought that was cool. But then, somewhere around like 06, 07, Gaslight started getting serious. And, right from the beginning of Gaslight, I had noticed something different in the way people were receiving it. I had been in bands for a long time before then. I had played people my music a lot of times, literally salivating over what their reaction is going to be. So I got pretty skilled at maybe being a gauge. And I could tell there was something different with Gaslight. It was like the first time I was playing music for people where people were like, oh yeah, that's good, Benny, to where they're like, oh shit, wow, cool, I'll listen to this, and then before I know it.
Yeah.
So I think early on from Gaslight, I saw the fact that like it had the legs I wanted. And I knew early on that like, this is something we should take really seriously. So actually the original demos for Gaslight Anthem, the CDs, were all made at the Daily Targum office late at night. And even the early inserts for Sink or Swim were created and printed at the Daily Targum office. So I was basically, I guess, stealing their paper and resources
for CD or records?
For both. So originally we had, the 3-song demo with We Came to Dance, Drive, and Navasync, maybe? So essentially the XO thing was Brian's old band, This Charming Man, was signed to XOXO. And he had gone on a tour. He didn't like the way it was working and ended up basically replacing the whole band. And shortly after is when Brian and I got connected through a mutual friend, and we started playing together. So very early on, I was actually in basically This Charming Man.
Right.
And the only song that existed from This Charming Man that still existed for Gaslight is the early version of 1930. That song came with them. So we started that, and we went in very, very early to try to record a record for XO. They put us in a really nice studio, and it just really didn't go well. We were a little too green as players, as, producers. I don't think we totally had a sense of what we were doing yet. And also the people on the other side were very kind of corporate sounding and just kind of, not really presenting it in an easy way. Oh, this was at the time. I'm sorry, I'm confusing this. This was Eyeball Records. So we were initially going to be on Eyeball Records, and we went in to record the record for Eyeball, and it went south. And basically the producer and the owner of Eyeball told Brian that we're willing to keep this deal if you hire professional musicians to finish this record. I don't know exactly what they said to him, but luckily, Brian was committed to us at that point, believed in what we were doing enough that, he was like, nah, this isn't right. And we were like, nah, it's done.
And just quickly looking at Eyeball Records roster, they've got My Chemical Romance, H2O.
They broke My Chemical Romance on Thursday. So at the time, they had a ton of money.
Casualties.
Yeah, they had a ton of money. Well, that's, Eyeball Records had started, when I was growing up, they were like a New York punk hardcore label, kind of like Casualties and bands like that. And then they broke Thursday and My Chem, and it just turned into like an entirely different thing. And that guy has a very sketchy reputation. You could ask 100 people and 50 would say something bad. And so it went south and it went bad. And Jay from XOXO Records, who was an old friend, basically stepped up right after and was like, listen, I'll still put out your record. I believe in you and you can do this. So basically we went back, we did our demo, we started pushing that, and Jay was still okay with the record. Somewhere in that time too, we also replaced the guitar player with Alex Rosamilia. And once that happened, it officially really changed from This Charming Man to the Gaslight Anthem. Like we had kind of the last chance to change our name at that point. We did it
right.
Just because it was such a different incarnation of what we were at that time. And then, and then Sink or Swim came out, and it certainly wasn't automatic. We had a lot of work and a lot of touring and a lot of, 5-person shows in the middle of the South. And, I wasn't, we weren't 100% confident that this was gonna break or something, but somewhere around like the summer of 2007 going into 2008, we had so much touring booked that I could no longer like budget working at the Daily Targum and doing Gaslight. I had really like pushed my limits with that job as much as I could, where I had people covering for me when I was on tour. People didn't even know, like people from administration didn't even know I was on tour sometimes. So, I was snaking them for everything I could for like a year. But part of my thinking was like, I need a cushion for when I quit. Like I need, like if I'm going to quit for Gaslight and I'm going to do music full time, I need like a cushion to live off of, before or when like something happens, basically to just continue living.
You knew that, you'd had enough experience to see that bands don't get paid in their first 2 years of touring.
Yeah. I like certainly, even I wasn't expecting money. And even my whole concept of like what it took to be a full-time band was so different then. I mean, Brian and I had told each other we were going to get throat tattoos if we sold 10,000 records. And we said that because in our heads, 10,000 records meant like you were good forever. Like you were now like officially one of those bands and you never had to get a real job and you were cool. So that's like the level of our, naivety at that time. But somewhere along that point, I basically, right before the 59 sound, I had already stopped working at Targum and I was living with a girlfriend in North Brunswick, New Jersey. And that went very south, very fast while I was on the road, and basically came home to no apartment and essentially just went like homeless for the next like 3 years until I met my now wife and we moved in together. So for the most part, we were touring all the time. And anytime I was home, I had been crashing with my brother, but then he had a baby and it was an apartment and that didn't work very well.
59 Sound was, I might be right, it was side one dummy, right?
Yes.
Was there like a cash injection? Not to be like clumsy about it, but was there that kind of semi-promise, that future?
I honestly couldn't tell you off the top of my head what or if our advance was from side one. I don't even know if there was one and it was significant. I'm not sure.
But it wasn't enough for you to think that like, oh, it's going to be fine.
No. That really didn't happen until later where, it's strange, man. It's like a weird, there's no middle class in music, and you kind of just go, and all of a sudden, things are going, you're like, wait, how much did I just come home from on that tour? Holy shit. That's like real money where like maybe I could start paying rent again or something, So it was really like kind of a slow realization almost that like it was getting real to that point. And then within a couple years, it was a bunch of money, you know, where like it was totally different. So yeah, for those years, I stayed with friends, I stayed with my brother, and then if it was a short tour, I would come stay at the motel, like the Motel 6. Actually, it's funny, it's the same motel that Tim Barry talks about on his first album, the Motel 6 in East Brunswick, the land of no left turns. Yeah, it's like that was the same one that I used to crash at because it was cheap and really close to New Brunswick.
And you remained undeterred.
Yeah, I mean, again, it was like I actually kind of enjoyed it in a way, you know. I mean, I can remember some strange, isolated nights, you know, like maybe a little drunk in a motel, being like, "What the fuck is going on right now?" You know, there was definitely, you know, there's moments, you know, when it's like 11:30 at night and you're walking down Route 18 trying to find like Chinese food or something on the highway of a shoulder, you know, shoulder of a highway, just like, man, am I making the right decisions?
But I mean, touring in a punk band, it's kind of, you know, this kind of traveler's life, right?
Yes. And there's a part of it that I realize, you know, that aspect of it, I think I was accustomed to and ready for just because of all we talked about earlier. You know, my childhood and my life was just constantly filled with disruption. You know, I never had steadiness at home. I never lived in the same place. By the time I was 13, 14, I was just dying to get the fuck out of the house. I would sleep at whoever's house would let me. I'd spend weekends with friends. And so I do think, and then even the living situations I were in I was in punk rock houses, man. I was in houses with like 5 or 6 people all renting. The places were a fucking mess. They were loud. You know, the only sanctuary I ever had was my bedroom, which I'm still to this day, like, meticulously neat in my bedroom, because it was like the only place you could actually control. Like if you try to control the kitchen in one of those houses, you're gonna fucking bash your head against the wall because it's just a Sisyphean task. You know, you can only.
Were you alone in this kind of like the living lifestyle? I suppose you were doing. Were the other 3 members doing a similar thing?
Yeah, none of those guys were in a very good position either. Alex Levine was really young. He was 18 when Sink or Swim came out. So he was still with his parents. But at the time, the house we were practicing at was a giant rented house up in North Jersey that housed Alex Levine and his entire family, Brian, who was married to Alex's sister, and also one of their friends who was renting space in the basement. So it was like kind of this like strange giant rented house up in North Jersey, where like they were all kind of in a unique situation too, that they, trust me, wanted to get the fuck out of, definitely. And then Alex Rosamilia was also on his own. He was paying rent. I think the last job he had prior to Gaslight going full time was being a warehouse manager at Guitar Center. Oh, and then he had a strange blip as a shift manager at Puma. I remember because he hired me once to DJ at a Puma store.
Great.
I played a bunch of King Crimson songs and got some free gear. It was pretty cool.
Fuck yeah.
So there is a lot of truth to the whole Sink or Swim thing for us. Like that wasn't some made up illusion at the time. Like we were kind of living that mantra, honestly. I know it seems cheesy maybe to talk about, but like we were going for it, you know, and we were all super aware of what happens if we don't get there. You know what I mean? Brian knew if this isn't happening, he's going back and he's doing a working class job because that's what he knew how to do, you know, and things like that. And that's not what we wanted. You know, we wanted to do this. So there is almost nothing that you could have told us to deter us from the goal at that time. And I think it was one of the really strong things that helped Gaslight is, you know, you need a unification of goals from the people. And if you're all looking in the same direction, it really helps making choices and making the right choices and stuff like that. So Yeah, I think that was really in our benefit early on. And especially, you know, Brian and I didn't meet until I was 26, he was 27. And we had both been trudging along for years by that point, you know, playing in bands that couldn't get anywhere, working shit jobs, taking care of ourselves since we were out of high school. And, you know, we really truly knew what the alternative was. And we didn't want it. And we used to even say it, like before we would go on stage, we would like give each other a fist bump and be like, it's fucking better than work. And that was really like a driving force of all of it. But it's cool that this podcast is about jobs, because the Daily Targum really did play an integral role in the beginning of Gaslight Anthem, for sure.
Excellent, Benny. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, that was epic. I think you have a podcast series all of a sudden.
I've been working all day for me mate on the side, running around like a blue-ass fly. I've been working all day for me mate. Every bleeding minute I've been on the go, up and down the ladder like a fiddler's elbow. I've been working all day for me mate. Waiting for tomorrow at 10:30 when I sign up, but until then I've been working all day for me mate.
This is a Mighty Moon Media podcast.